Hi friends, future/present Adriana here. Before we get into the video, I did want to address recent events specifically relating to Black Lives Matter and other anti-racist movements, which I fully support. And if you've been on any of my platforms, you know that's not a secret. My mission statement here at Perpetual Pages has always been to uplift and support marginalized voices, and this is no different. I have been trying to use my platforms to make space for Black creators, Black voices, and resources to support these movements, whether on the streets or from home, publicly or privately, whatever your capacity is. All of that said, the video you're about to see was filmed and edited before everything that happened last week, and that's kind of the double-edged sword of pre-filming, right? Because sometimes your content exists in a time capsule that doesn't leave room for additional context and that isn't able to account for situations that are rapidly changing on a day-to-day basis. But that is not an excuse, because systemic racism, especially in regards to Black communities, is sadly not a new concept. All of this to say that I have no vested interest in being silent or ignorant, so if past Adriana comes off as starry-eyed and out of touch, it's because they were in that moment. But at the same time, I didn't want to scrap this video completely because I still think the stories I talk about in this video do their own part in their own way to decenter whiteness, and so I still wanted to give them that space. So to at least partially rectify my lack of acknowledgement in this past video, I have included some links down below to ways you can support anti-racist movements and efforts that are easy, actionable, and safe for everyone. That will be in the description down below and in a pinned comment as well, so I encourage you to check that out. So keep that in mind as you watch this pre-film video, and I hope if you have the capacity or ability to support those in need in any way, you will consider doing so, and I will continue to reflect on how I can be more helpful and mindful in the content I produce. Bibliophiles of the internet, my name's Adriana, and today I'm here to bring you my May wrap-up. First off, I did not anticipate needing a cool things that have happened to me segment 2 months in a row, but cool things do continue to happen, and frankly, I don't understand it. So I was ready for May to just quietly come and go, and then mere days into May, Stephen Colbert decides to name drop Quarantine Pages in his community calendar segment. In the video, he's joined by John Mulaney, and they talk about Quarantine Pages in a light sort of jokey way, but joke's on them because a lot of people have come to us because of that segment. So that was cool. And then talk about things I had no idea were happening. NetGalley decided to feature me among many other amazing marginalized creators in a booktubers you should follow kind of post, which was wild. And that would be enough, right? Like I should stop talking at this point. But then I actually got to conduct some really cool author interviews on Quarantine Pages. I did 3 of those in May. The first 2 have already been edited, captioned, and uploaded onto my channel. Those are with Kristen Lambert, author of The Boy in the Red Dress, which a lot of you expressed interest in last month, so definitely go support that one. And then I also got to talk with Aiden Thomas, author of Cemetery Boys, which I still cannot process those words in that order, in that sentence. And the last one that is not up yet but will be in the future is with Alechia Dow, author of The Sound of Stars, which I freaking love, and I cannot wait to see how that one turns out. So that's everything, I think, and all of those things will of course be linked down below if you want to check them out. I am truly humbled by all of these things because I still very much see myself as a dorky queer Latinx book nerd weeb who is honestly faking all of this till they make it, just trying to read books and mind their own business. Speaking of which, you're here for the books, of course. So to recap, May was the Asian Read-a-thon to celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and it was also the Ramadan Read-a-thon and Tome Topple as well. So obviously I took part in all of those things to some extent. The first book I read in May was Stand Up Yumi Chung by Jessica Kim. It's an Own Voices middle grade contemporary story about a Korean American girl named Yumi Chung who wants to be a stand-up comedian, but that is never going to happen according to her immigrant parents. They would rather she focus on getting a scholarship to this private school, which would ease their stress as they try to save their failing Korean restaurant. One day on her way to a prep course, she stumbles into this comedy camp for kids taught by one of her favorite YouTube comedians, and when Yumi is mistaken for someone enrolled in the camp, she just doesn't correct them because this could be her big chance. I really appreciate the internal conflict of Yumi loving comedy but struggling with shyness and self-consciousness, so you really get to see her emotional journey on the way to self-confidence. The story also shows us that while comedy is a form of entertainment, it's also a space where comedians make themselves very vulnerable, and it can also be a space of healing as they piece together things that have happened to them and, in a way, make sense of those experiences as they go through their set. And Yumi is really held back by her fear of failing, and she's afraid that she's gonna fail at being herself, which I think is a response to this idea, especially for POC, that if you're gonna do something different, you better be damn good at it, because that's how you're going to secure success. And that really ties into her relationship with her parents, because on the surface it seems like they're harsh and disapproving, when the reality is that they view her future in a very different way because they're immigrants and because they have their own insecurities with success. Something else I really appreciate is how this story deconstructs white privilege, especially because everyone's telling Yumi, just be yourself, just tell your parents you want to take comedy classes, tell your parents you don't want to be in a prep course. And Yumi understands that if you're not white, that's not how any of this works. Getting what you want exactly how you want it is often not a reality for many POC and many children of immigrants especially, and I love that the story confronts that. Maybe the end game isn't getting what you want, but learning how to love yourself and others better, and how to take what you've been given and use it in the best way you know how. This story is equal parts hilarious, heartwarming, and emotional, and for that I gave it 4.5 stars. After that, I finally listened to The Book of Salt by Monique Trong, read by Paul Bomer. This is Own Voices for the Vietnamese Rep. It's a queer historical fiction piece about this man named Bain, who was a live-in cook for Gertrude Stein and her lover Alice B. Toklas. It's inspired by a man who actually lived and was their cook, and it's basically an elaborate extrapolation of real-life events. This man was literally a footnote in one of Alice B. Toklas's cookbooks, I believe, and Monique Trong wanted to explore what his life would have been like as a queer Vietnamese immigrant living and working in France. Content warnings for some incurred homophobia and use of outdated racial epithets. I don't know how to talk about this book because it's honestly a masterpiece. It took me to a completely different place, and I knew within paragraphs that it was going to change my life. Like the same feeling I got when I read The Song of Achilles. Bain has such a unique perspective, especially as an immigrant living in France who is not fluent in French. He is often mocked and taken advantage of because he lacks that knowledge and because he's not able to connect like everyone else does. And because of that, he develops this really interesting way of defining things in the negative and coming to understand really complex concepts by thoroughly outlining what they are not. And I feel like that's such an apt reflection of how he understands his identity as a queer Vietnamese man, by understanding what he can never be and what he never was, if that makes sense. This is such an intricate character study, and there are times when the narration will leave you sort of suspended in a moment while the story backtracks to help you understand on such an intimate level how we got to that point. Just one example, there was a moment where Alice B. Toklas answers a door, and then there was like paragraphs and paragraphs about who she is and what her role is in this household as a lover and a partner, all to show us why she would be the one to open the door and no one else. So when she opens that door, you believe it, and it makes so much sense. And to go back to Bain, he's living in this world that rejects him in so many ways, and so many doors are slammed in his face just because of who he is. And it's about his desperation to assert his existence and find those spaces he can claim as his. He talks about how none of his employers ever use his name, and how he carries around this pocket mirror just so that he can see himself and remind himself that he is real. And that hits in a way I can't even explain. This story is ambitiously told, wildly complex, and masterfully written in a way I am definitely not doing justice. Even though I recognize it's not going to be for everyone, by the end I was shaken to my core, and it was an easy 5 stars. Then on Sajid's recommendation, and as part of the Ramadan Read-a-thon, I read Once Upon an Eid, edited by S.K. Ali and Aisha Saeed. It's an Own Voices, mostly middle grade anthology comprised of Muslim authors, and all the stories are about the time leading up to Eid, one of the biggest Islamic celebrations. There are 2 Eids every year, and it's often a time for fasting, reflection, charity, sacrifice, special prayers, and of course spending time with family and friends. This collection is exactly what it says in the subtitle. It is hopeful and joyous. I love how widespread this collection is in terms of its perspectives, because it shows us that Islam is for everyone, whether you're Asian or Latinx or Black or something else, whether you wear the hijab or don't, don't, whether you're a lifelong Muslim or a convert. This collection shows us that every Muslim is equal in their faith and their experiences. I also love that this story shows how Eid can be both a time of excitement because of new clothes and Eid gifts and special foods, but it can also be a time for remembering those who are gone or reflecting on how you and your understanding of the world has changed between Eids. My only note is a minor one, but I would have loved to see even more intersectionality in these stories because we definitely need more rep for queer Muslims and disabled Muslims, neurodivergent Muslims, and there's just so much room for so many more voices in a collection like this. But overall, I really enjoyed it. I think it's a beautiful collection and a great way to sample a lot of really exciting Muslim voices, and so I gave it 4 stars. Afterwards, I listened to The Best at It by Malik Pancholi, read by the author himself. This is a wonderful Own Voices queer middle grade contemporary story about a young Indian American boy named Rahul Kapoor who is gay and awkward, and because he doesn't have many friends, he has vowed that this is gonna be his year and he will find the thing that he's super good at. The problem is he has no idea what the heck that is, and he's really worried that he will continue to be bullied relentlessly if he does not figure it out quick. Content warnings for incurred bullying and harassment, incurred homophobia, as well as depictions of anxiety, panic attacks, and obsessive-compulsive tendencies. This is such a necessary story because it's really about dismantling internalized self-hatred in so many ways. Rahul has been bullied and relatively friendless his entire middle school life, and he's become so embarrassed about the color of his skin, the texture of his hair, his family's accents, and he's terrified of looking inwards and asking himself who he really is and what he really wants. As a young man, he's not only been taught to value whiteness, but to covet whiteness and to erase himself in the pursuit of whiteness. This story also tackles the model minority myth, this idea that being palatable and being perfect will ultimately win you acceptance, when in reality it will only strip you of everything that makes you powerful and different. And at the same time, it's also about how the fear of confirming stereotypes can steer us away from our truths. For example, Rahul loves math, and he's really good at math, and he's terrified that if he joins the mathletes, it will only confirm all the crap he's ever heard about how all Indians are super nerdy and super smart. There's also parallels with that and Rahul coming to understand himself as gay, because if he's gay, it'll seemingly confirm all the shame and sadness others have made him feel about it over the years, which sucks. So we see that the negative stigma surrounding stereotypes can be even more harmful than the actual stereotype in some cases. This is a beautiful and funny story of self-discovery about how family, friendship, and culture can be lifelines in a world that often makes very little sense, and I loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars. Then, because this author was going to be our first ever guest on Quarantine Pages, I last minute listened to Riot Baby by Tochi Onyebuchi, read by the author himself. This is a powerful Own Voices sci-fi novella about 2 siblings, Ella and Kev, who both have extraordinary powers. Ella specifically has the ability to see the future, for better or worse, and can manipulate things around her with just the power of her thoughts. Kev ends up being imprisoned as an adult, pretty much just for being a black man in America, and it's basically about how both he and Ella are both motivated by their anger to revolt and bring the world to its knees. Content warnings for racism, references to famous murders, massacres, and shootings, police brutality, depictions of incarceration, depictions of blood and graphic violence, and brief mentions of suicide ideation and a suicide attempt. I was so impressed by how much this story had to offer and how much it accomplishes in such a short space. I think Ella's ability especially is such a powerful metaphor, not only for blackness itself, but also for injustice. She sees these visions, these depictions of the world that no one else sees, and that's exactly how injustice works and thrives. This is also one of the only fictional stories I've seen where a significant portion takes place in a prison, and it really gives you an insightful look at that experience. Through both Ella and Kev, this story shows us that hope and anger can live in the same body in equal measures, and that anger is not a liability or a weakness, but a form of strength that has the power to change the world world as we know it. This novella really brings the reader to a place of unrest and discomfort with no offers of easy solutions, which I really appreciate, and it's also a wonderful study in voice. It can be hard to read at times, but it's also this incredibly close and intimate family saga, and that's exactly why I gave it 4.5 stars. After that, again for the Ramadan Read-a-thon and Asian Read-a-thon, I read Other Words for Home by Jasmine Warga. This is another Own Voices middle grade contemporary story written in verse. It's about a young Syrian girl named Jade who is forced to move to America with her pregnant mother when their hometown becomes much too unsafe and violent. There she's trying to learn English and make friends and be in the school play, while part of her is still back in Syria with the friends and family she left behind, and she's trying to understand where she belongs between these two places. Content warnings for racism, Islamophobia, peripheral mentions of war violence, and some depictions of hate crimes. This is a wonderful exploration of how people who straddle two cultures are often faced with this false choice between which parts of themselves to keep, which language to use, which traditions to practice, and which values to adopt. And it becomes even more fraught when you're trying to figure out how you honor and remember where you come from while also trying to belong in a completely new place. So I think the story does a good job of navigating that conflict along with political and cultural turmoil, but also just giving Jade space to be a normal kid who wants what normal kids want. Overall, I think it's a wonderfully affirming story about being generous of heart and how we only have something to gain when we have something to give, whether it's to others or to ourselves. My only hang-up was the form. I don't really feel like the story needed to be written in verse. There were some moments where certain lines really landed, but to me the form lacks the kind of purpose and intent that makes up what poetry is. And that's coming from someone who has a degree in part in poetry, so take that as you will. I am not the ultimate critic, just take it with a grain of salt. And more importantly, I think the brevity of the form left me wanting a little bit more from the relationship dynamics as well, but I still really enjoyed this and I gave it a solid 4 stars. Then it was time for Tome Topple, and I started off with The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, read by Emily Wu Zeller. It's an Own Voices epic fantasy story inspired by the Second Sino-Japanese War, and it's about this war orphan named Rin who aces this incredibly prolific empire-wide test and ends up attending the most prestigious academy for warrior trainees. As a poor, dark-skinned student from the countryside, she finds herself ostracized and out of place, and she finds herself training under one master who is especially unorthodox. She comes to learn that the gods she once believed to be long dead are very much alive, and that she can call on them under the right conditions. As she's training, a major war breaks out, and she is quickly going to find out whether her education has properly prepared her or not. Content warnings for graphic descriptions of blood, gore, violence, rape, bodily mutilation, dismemberment, and dead bodies, mentions of massacres, infanticide, human trafficking, and human experimentation, instances of colorism, racism, misogyny, substance abuse and addiction, use of mind-altering drugs, and verbal and physical abuse. Additionally, there are some instances of unchallenged ableism on the page. That was a lot. And because of that, I do want to preface this by saying that this is one of those books I would never blanket recommend. I would have to know the person I'm recommending it to very well, and I would preface it with a ton of caveats. I will say that the really horrifying parts of this story, which I do want to emphasize are quite descriptive, are pretty much contained to one part of one chapter, so if that's a concern, you can definitely skip over it without losing any context. But anyways, what I admire about this story is that it's definitely a Slytherin book. Rin is hot-headed and power-hungry, and she will make terrible choices if it means accruing more power for even the smallest chance of extinguishing this war in a single strike. She is passionate and short-sighted and reckless, but she still has so much humanity because she is terrified of death, destruction, and loss. Once this war starts becoming real for her, she is rocked to her very core by the idea that innocent people might get hurt, that she might get hurt, and she is willing to sacrifice everything to stop it. Like a lot of people have said before, there's a definite change in tone between the first and second parts of the story, which I didn't mind so much because that tonal shift is what makes that turn so jarring and shocking, and I think it works. What I did take issue with during that academy section is that it felt like the school element was a lazy world-building device. Like if there was something about the world or the history that the audience had to know, Rin would just go to class and the reader would be subjected to the entire lecture in in order to get that context. That was really my only issue with the world building, but overall I was completely consumed by the emotional war between Rin's compassion and her terrible judgment, and overall I gave this one 4 stars. And then my second pick for Tome Topple was Jade Ward by Fonda Lee, read by Andrew Kishino. This is another sprawling Own Voices urban fantasy about the island of Keikon, which is run by 2 powerful crime syndicates who produce and harvest jade, which is a magical element that can grant the person wearing it enhanced powers, but only if they've undergone the traditional training first. Suddenly, a new drug surfaces that makes it easier to wear jade and curb its addictive and overwhelming powers, which could potentially open up the jade market to foreigners, which firstly is bad for business, and secondly could potentially be the genesis of a new threat. Content warnings for graphic violence, some drug use, descriptions of addiction and self-harm, graphic injury, death, trauma, some instances of abduction, and some peripheral mentions of rape and assault. Before I even get into this, I just have to say, this book fucked me the fuck up, and I still don't know how to talk about it. Part of it is that the mafia aspect is so delicious to me for some reason. Like, I really enjoy suited up thugs saying, I'm gonna send them a message, more than I ever thought. But in all seriousness, I think Fonda Lee absolutely nailed the familial dynamics between these characters, the obligation they feel towards one another, their experience with filial piety, but on an even larger scale within the No Peak clan, and just the ways they're willing to put themselves second and sacrifice. Those, I think, were the most gut-wrenching moments when a character is realizing that if it was just them, they would not do this thing, but because it would benefit the clan and the family, they're willing to go through with whatever it is. And there's also this commentary on colonization and cultural appropriation through the dissemination of the jade market and how foreigners want to be able to wear and use jade without understanding the training or the deeply cultural traditions and implications behind it. Quite frankly, that mindset is irresponsible at best and potentially dangerous, and it poses a very real threat to all of the Keikon clans regardless of status, class, or size. And as a lot of people have mentioned before, Fonda Lee has multiple black belts, I believe, and her understanding of the human body, especially in combat, just comes through in this very clear, very vivid imagery, and the fight scenes in this book are actually the best. There's action, there's betrayal of the highest order, there's politics and strategy, and just this struggle to be seen and respected in this tumultuous landscape, and I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. So in between reading those incredibly intense tomes, I also read my arc of I'll Be the One by Lila Lee. I don't remember the date, but I know this one comes out in June. It's an Own Voices queer YA contemporary story about Sky Shin, a fat bisexual Korean-American teenager who signs up for this international reality competition to find the next K-pop stars, even though she's always been told that fat girls should not dance. But Sky is here to make herself the center of attention, make people uncomfortable, break all the rules, and potentially fall for a fellow competitor in the process. Content warnings for incurred fat phobia, bullying, online harassment, verbal harassment, peripheral instances of homophobia, and some explorations of emotional trauma and emotional abuse. Sky Shin is a legend because she's really out here showing people that you can be fat and sing, you can be fat and dance, and you can be fat while you sing and dance like an absolute badass. This story talks about how people have so many preconceived notions about what fat bodies can and cannot do, and that there's such a conflation between capability and fatness that should not exist because it's patently false. Sky has internalized so much shame about her body and this messaging that she should make herself smaller, hide herself away, and privilege other people's discomfort when that's not the life she deserves or wants. The story is about Sky learning to stand up for herself, yes, but it's also about how the burden of fighting for her right to exist should never have been hers to take on in the first place. There's also this commentary on the very fine line between strict Asian parenting and flat-out emotional abuse. Sky's mom especially is always criticizing Sky's body out of concern and because she cares, but it's clear to see that saying harmful things, even with good intentions, is just not right. That relationship with her mom is so fraught, and I really appreciate that Sky's endgame is just to stand in her own light and not to try and change someone who doesn't understand the harm they can cause. I did also want to say that I love that both Sky and the other main character, Henry Cho, are bisexual icons, and I love that the story celebrates that even if you're in a straight passing relationship, your queerness is no less. And there's also some really interesting parallels between Sky and Henry and where they are on their journeys to understanding their bodies in relation to public consumption, and I love that. Overall, this was fun and romantic and brilliant, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I read my Patreon pick for May, which was The Silence of Bones by June Her, read by Greta Jung. This is a recently released Own Voices historical murder mystery set in the Joseon era in Korea, and it's about this orphaned soul who finds herself as a damo assisting a well-respected inspector as he investigates a politically charged murder case. While she observes the inspector's movements and does some digging of her own, she discovers evidence that seems to lead to the inspector himself as the prime suspect. Content warnings for descriptions of torture, displays of physical punishment, references to religious persecution and religious killings, mentions of suicide, and some instances of abuse. To give a little bit of context, Seoul is what's known as a damo, which is basically a social class even beneath slaves, and damos were often assigned to various odd jobs within the government. So when the story begins and Seoul finds herself mixed up in this investigation, she is definitely struggling with this deeply internalized idea that she is no one, she is nothing, and she has no rights. But digging into this case actually challenges Seoul's understanding of her agency, her bravery, and even her self-worth as she becomes more and more invested in pursuing justice. She realizes that she has a unique perspective, that she can see things that the inspector doesn't because of his privilege and status, and that playing the part of the humble, obedient servant can get her in a lot of doors. The trajectory of this case is also intertwined with uncovering mysteries about her own past and her family, which makes it feel like so much more is at stake. I do think the structure could have been a little bit tighter, and there were some moments where Seoul would run into someone who just so happens to have important information they're willing to share, which did feel a little bit convenient. But overall, I think it's a really unique and compelling historical mystery, and I gave it 4 stars. Now, I'm actually filming this a little bit early, so I'm still trying to finish The Sound of Stars by Alechia Dow. I have like 5% left, so it's definitely gonna happen. And also, with any luck, my digital arc of Vanessa Yu's Magical Paris Tea Shop by Roselle Lim. Even though I'm a good way into both of these, I don't think it would be productive to review them without completely finishing them first. So my concession to you is that I will definitely do written reviews on Goodreads for both of those books, and when those are available, they will be linked in the description downstairs. So in conclusion, May was a wild one, but thankfully I was also able to read some really great books. So if you've read any of these yourself, I would love to hear from you in the comments below so we can discuss. But that's everything I had for this wrap up today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you on the flip side of the page.